Kent University's 4th Annual Americanist Conference. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are unable to attend today's conference, we will be sharing some recordings, but we also will be putting you in touch with people through the program. Similarly, this panel is being recorded just so you're aware, so we can give it to people who cannot make it today. Throughout the day, we've had a real breadth of fascinating presentations examining American history and culture and speculating new liberated futures. This keynote will return to the themes of today's conference: art, activism, nation building, and sustainability. The panel is entitled Ending Erasure, Deconstructing the Colonial Mythology of the Americas. It was named by our panelist, Hartman Deetz, and speaks to the focus of this discussion, a consideration of how erasure impacts the everyday lives of Indigenous people and the work being done to dismantle this. I'm Millie Mulcahy. I will be posing questions to Hartman and Dylan, and this is very much an open discussion and an opportunity for you to ask your questions. The chat is monitored, so please drop your questions in there and we will just come to them when we do. I'm a PhD student at the University of Kent and co-organizer of this conference. I've been working with historical educators for 10 years in the UK and in Turtle Island. My research considers the challenges of public historians' work, particularly the difficulties of using historical education as a form of social justice. I've been fortunate enough to work with both of our panelists, and I'm delighted to be able to connect you to them as part of today's conference. So to get started, I wonder if Dylan and Hartman could introduce themselves. Dylan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. My name is Dylan Smith. I grew up in a family, most of my father's side, it comes from the Shinnecock and Wampanoag Nations of Long Island, New York. I currently reside in my girlfriend and son's territory in Canada, Ganawag Mohawk Reservation. Give you guys just a little bit of my background. I've worked at multiple different museums, either portraying or creating different programs for museums for Indigenous culture, Indigenous lifeways, and other things like that. I currently work for a group in Ganawag that promotes language and culture. So just some of the stuff I've done. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Hartman?
Kui Kwasin, Natuswis Hartman, Nutamas Masipiat, Kanin Mashpee Wampanoag. Hello, my name is Hartman. I'm from Mashpee. I am a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I've worked in cultural arts and education for, I guess, 25, 30 years, trying to find ways to help sustain our history, our language, our physical culture, building houses and canoes and boats and spoons, and to hold on to the stories, the songs, the dances as well. So that's been my life work, has been to try to hold on to these things in the face of assimilation.
Thank you. My first question was actually about the title, but I think we can bring assimilation into that. And that was to start by unpacking the title. And could you explain what erasure means to you in your experience? And we can include within that assimilation as a form of erasure, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for the standard of my whole life in school, and when we opened up a book to study American history in the American school system, you open up the book and you start with the Renaissance in Europe. If you study European history, I'm pretty sure the story starts in Europe. I'm pretty sure if you study Chinese history, the story starts in China. But for some reason, when you study the history of the Americas, the story starts in Europe. And that's an erasure of a whole history of people right here who have been on this land for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And with that erasure, you get to insert whatever story you want. You get to make up stories. You get to decide that we came over on the land bridge because that suits your needs, or that we're the lost tribe of Israel, or that we are, put here by ancient aliens, if you want to get that absurd. So, the idea that you can't start the actual story of us, with us, of this land, in this land, is the beginning of erasure. The fact of the matter is that there have been a number of migrations into the Americas. This has been shown more and more with more and more evidence that piles up all the time. The Bering Land Bridge being one of them, another population of folks that came across the Pacific and into South America. That's actually the truth of the story. Our stories tell the same, and the scientific genetic evidence backs that up. So if you start looking at the oral histories, the stories of creation of the people, or the stories of migration of the people themselves, you'll actually find a lot of education, a lot of actual history, not just mythology, not just a fancy story that you think sounds cute, but actual stories of how people came to be into the space that they're in now. Through the struggles, through their time, through their conflicts with their neighbors, through their watching the land itself change. And this is the beginning of it. But then again, when we even talk about issues in modern times that moves up into current day, I just had a meeting yesterday with a city councilwoman from the town of Newton, Massachusetts, and she was talking about the effort to change Christopher Columbus Day to Indigenous People Day in Newton, which just happened last year, and I'm thankful for it. We got to join them in the celebration, but she said even in the discussions in the town meetings, she brought it up in the town meeting, and one of the other elected officials in the town said, well, why does it matter? There aren't any Indians left anyway. So this is where you got the erasure from the very beginning all the way up until now, where there's an assumption that we no longer exist, that we're extinct, that we're something of the past only. And we aren't even really allowed to truly have that in our own words. So end to end, we are denied a sense of our own story. We're always some bit player in somebody else's narrative. And we have a whole 12,000 years of history that's our own, that is, a part of what creates us as distinct people. And if you give us the chance to tell it for ourselves, I think we would all do better off, and it would enrich the world. And so.
Thank you very much, Hartman. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Dylan?
I mean, just going off of what Hartman said, I mean, for my schooling, I don't remember covering Native history at all until high school. And in high school, it was just a little blimp, you just went over it very quickly. You didn't cover much in depth. You didn't really cover anything at all. So the American school system, like Hartman was saying, just does not cover Native history whatsoever. And like he says, that leads to this idea that Native people are no longer around, that Native people don't have this expansive history for thousands of years that has any worth of learning, because like he said, the minute you start learning American history, it starts with Europe. And there's people here far before that, people still here, and it has value to learn about, but I guess that America isn't ready to take that step yet. Hopefully someday they might be able to. So
thank you. I wanted to elaborate on that before we dive into the chat, and just ask, you've both worked on public history sites, you both work directly with the public, and what are some of the challenges you have educating the public on this history, particularly around their misrepresentations, kind of where they're coming from on that, if you want to start that, Dylan.
Yeah, me and Hartman worked at the same museum, or one of the same museums, called Plymouth Plantation, and that's where the bulk of my public experiences have come from, as well as a few other museums and projects and other things like that. The biggest one is Native people are no longer around. Most people thought all the people there that were portraying Native people were just actors, people that came in during the day dressed up as such and went home at night. But no, you constantly had to tell them, no, these are all real Native people here. Once the clothes are taken off, it doesn't change. It's just modern people now, right? So that was one of the biggest hurdles that we constantly had to jump over because, like I said, and like Hartman said, a lot of people think Native people don't exist anymore. Some of the other hurdles that we had to deal with are stereotypes about how a Native person should look, or how a Native person's life historically should look. Most people think over in the East we're hunting buffalo and stuff like that, which is not true at all. You don't have buffalo out in the East like you do in the plains. It's a very different lifestyle. You don't live in teepees. You know, the whole culture is very different. America, Canada, South America, Central America is extremely diverse when it comes to Native culture. And a lot of people fail to recognize that because they get most of their info from movies or from, you know, like TV and other things like that, that don't portray Native people accurately at all. So just breaking down a lot of those stereotypes that people have.
Hartman, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just, affirm everything that Dylan says, for one, this is all very much part of the experience that I've seen in the world too. One of the things I got to do is I got to go down to South America and work with the Quechua folks down in Peru, and work with the indigenous people down there. And an experience I had that sort of speaks to another thing that Dylan touched on. There's a point in time when somebody asked, well, where are you from? What kind of people do you come from? And I told them that I was, an Indian, a native, and they didn't believe me. They said, well, you can't be because you're wearing jeans. And, and I said, well, what do you mean? I'm wearing jeans. And that doesn't make me not a native person. Well, sure. I mean, the native people, they live up in the mountains and they wear this, and you come down to the city, you're not an Indian anymore. Which is largely what people refer to native people as in the South America, Indios. But there's this concept that we lose legitimacy by modernizing. And I told him, I said, to this guy who was asking me the question, I said, do you think when the Spanish showed up and they got off those boats, you think that they were wearing Nikes? Do you think that they had jeans on? Do you think that they unloaded refrigerators? They didn't. And there's this idea that in order for us to continue to be who we are, we have to stay in the past. We can't drive cars or have telephones or live in apartment buildings or get on a Zoom call and still be authentically who we are. That this somehow invalidates us as being indigenous people. The only way to truly be authentically indigenous is to be stuck in the past and using stone tools and living off the land itself. And it denies us a place, our existence in the modern world, which everybody else has had the right to pursue an existence in the modern world. Everybody else has had the right to change and advance and move forward as technology moves forward, as time moves forward, but we're supposed to stop. And that's another part of how we experience erasure as well.
Absolutely, and there's clear political intent behind that narrative. But I want to dive into the questions. I have a question that's specific to Hart. It's been directed at Hartman, but I think Dylan can speak to it potentially as well. So it said, "Hi Hartman, how important is it for you to attend events such as the one at the Batterslaw Museum?" You might just need to explain the Mayflower project you did here in the UK, and do you approach such visits with any anxiety?
I'm a ham, so I don't get too anxious. I tend to do well with attention, but it's certainly something that some folks might get anxious about. But they are really important to be able to share our experience and our voice and who we are from ourselves in an authentic and distinct way that comes from us, because we have been denied that for so much of our existence in this past 400 years. There's always been someone speaking for us, deciding what we need, deciding what's going to help us, deciding what we're mad about, deciding what we want, and without ever actually asking us or talking to us or seeing about us, and to be able to actually speak for ourselves is really important. To share it with people of the United States is really important, but the world all over. Uh, I firmly believe that everybody, every culture in the world has something to offer each other. We all have uh, things that we can gain by experiencing a broader sense of humanity, and we are a part of that story. We are a valid part of that story, and we've often been left out. So to have any chance to do that, any place where we can, I think is helpful to us as a people, to have our story validated and heard, and to show that it's been valued, but also that other people might be able to gain from that. I met a great young guy there at Bassett Law Museum, which we went and we put up a traditional bark structure, a home that we would live in. We performed some songs and dances and engaged with the public with question and answer for about a week, and it was pretty great. And one young man that I met was really avid fan of languages and had looked at some Amerindian languages and was really impressed with his knowledge. So um, you know and to be able to actually have him exchange and hear some of the language of the Americas without just looking at the scientific notes and books, he was so he was thrilled by that as a lover of language, and without having the chance to meet somebody that spoke that language, how would he ever have that experience? So I thought that was a great thing to see. Dylan, you got anything on it?
I think you really summed that one up, honestly. Yeah.
I can move on. I'll move on to the next question, but thank you very much. And just so people know, that museum's in Retford in Nottinghamshire, and it's the local museum, and you can go there now if you want to see the We2 still up. So it's a really cool thing to see. The second question, you can definitely both speak to, is what do you think about the role of art in social movements, particularly the groups or efforts you're involved in? And what kind of power do you think art can have as a form of protest or resistance to things like ongoing colonialism? That's a great question from Charlotte there. Do you want to start with that, Dylan?
Yeah, I can do that. I find that, first of all, a lot of people are attracted to art. It doesn't matter what culture you come from, who you are. You can appreciate the work and the time and the beauty of the art. And I find that's one of the best ways for Native people, Native artists, to kind of get their message out there, because like I said, it doesn't matter who you are, you can still appreciate it, you can learn from it. It's not a lecture that you have to sit through and listen to. It speaks just seeing it. So I think it's just one of those ways that in our modern world is letting modern indigenous people kind of put their message out there to the general public. It's reaching more people, because like I said, you don't, when you're giving specific talks, you're doing specific events, you're only really hitting one target audience, that people that might be interested in history or this culture, that culture, or something like that. With art, it's kind of a broader umbrella. It can cover a lot of things, target a lot more people. So
Brilliant. Thank you. Hartman, did you want to talk about your
Yeah, art is hugely important to all sorts of things. It's what we imagine, and if we want to have a better world, we need to imagine it, and that's part of the practice of art. Is to use the imagination to think of what we want in this world and what we want better of this world, what's possible, and this is what art is fundamentally about. And that you can approach art in ways that that capture nuance and capture complexities that are really sometimes you can try writing a whole book to explain something, but yet you take 2 minutes to put it into a song and put those key words that are chosen to melody and music and create an emotional arc, and you've got a better communication of what's trying to be expressed in those what amounts to maybe 6 pages of writing with the lyrics and the musical notes all together, and it expresses and communicates better and more than chapters and chapters in an analytical book. And this is a really important aspect of art as well, and it's important in that it can capture emotion, which is really important to movement building and to addressing organizing, because we all have to really be moved by something, and there's only so many things that actually move people to action. And I think that the best thing to move people to action, the thing that really endures, is to figure out what you care about and what you love that's worth protecting and worth defending. And a lot of that can be discussed in the format of art, whether visual or musical or whatever all else. That these things are things that can enter into the discussion. But also, as well, lastly, is that it really creates, because you can use nuance, because you can use metaphor, because you can approach things indirectly. It really allows artists to speak truth to power in ways that you cannot directly call things out at times. Say things that are otherwise unsayable, things that you just shouldn't say unless you're somebody like George Bush, that's gonna make his blunders like he did today, but to be able to speak the unspeakable in ways that are safe and are not as easy to come back and repress and be oppressive about it, unless unless it becomes clear that by oppressing that, you villainize yourself as the powerful entity that seeks to oppress, and you show your colors as that. So art's really powerful in all of these ways, and really important to social movements because of its ability to capture that nuance, to speak truth to power, to use emotion, and to consolidate things in ways they often transcend language, that often transcend age, that often transcend economics, to the raw human experience. So,
thank you so much. It talks about, going back to the title around Erasure, it talks about the fact that there's lots of different mediums and lots of different processes that can be employed at any point. We have so many questions, so I'm going to just keep diving into the questions. So we have one from Kate Hefner, who's the co-organizer of this conference. Can you chat about how major media like smoke signals inspired by Sherman Alexie is being used, in present online community contexts? I'm thinking of remix media like TikTok and Instagram that can provide a platform to Indigenous creators.
I guess I'll go first on this one. I see a lot of, well, first of all, Smoke Signals is kind of the first of its kind talking about that specific movie, because it was almost like for Native people by Native people. It was really the first kind of movie that humanized Native people. They weren't just these bad guys out in the West in these Wild West movies, and it wasn't this supporting character, this stereotypical like tropes for Native people. It was a real movie about real life things, and it humanized people, right? So I see people using things like Smoke Signals and other things. Another big one that just came out was Res Dogs, really just educate people. And some of the parts of those movies and shows and stuff are funny too, so it's entertaining to people, but you also kind of get to learn certain aspects about modern Native people through that, and also using a platform like TikTok, which is geared towards your modern younger person for the most part. A lot of young people are getting exposure to culture and ideas and other media that they normally wouldn't. So.
Yeah. I mean, I remember growing up as a kid. I mean, the smoke signals was I mean, yeah, it really was groundbreaking. It was a big success was part of it as well. And to look and see, here are characters that are like people I know, that, they actually reflect people in my community. Wow, what a difference, to see real Indians on the screen. I mean, for me as a kid growing up, I mean, there was another one early on in the 80s, and it was a box office flop. It was called Powwow Highway. But it was also like, for me, like as a kid, I loved that movie. And it was a box office flop in a way that Smoke Signals wasn't, but it had real Indians in it, with Indian humor in it, with jokes that are from our style of how we communicate with each other, references that we understand because they're within the scope of our cultural experience. And that was, I mean, both of those were really big deals for me to see. But I mean, other than that, when I think about my growing up as a kid and what I had, I mean, just loving Lone Ranger because it had Tonto in it. And I mean, you know, what like just the absolute stereotypical, how type of Indian, and not necessarily a great image to base your sense of identity on if you're a impressionable young native kid. Um, not realistic, not somebody who could, if you took that character out of Hollywood and put him into one of our powwows of our community events, yeah, he wouldn't fit in. He just wouldn't fit in. But the the availability of native characters on television or in the movies that were even humanized enough to be anybody other than to be the guy to be shot off the horse, they were really few and far between. There's Tonto, there's that character on GI Joe, and what, like the Ultimate Warrior wrestler guy, who I don't even think he was actually an Indian. I think he just did the face makeup and the armbands. So like it's really slim pickings for a young, for me, a young guy growing up in the late 70s and early 80s. There was almost nothing for us to actually see and watch. That was an Indian on TV, and certainly a realistic one that actually was like your uncles or your cousins or somebody that you knew from the community. Yeah, good luck with that. So to see ourselves humanized, to see ourselves shown on TV, to see ourselves as a part of the the people that can be worth hearing a story about, is really important.
Absolutely, and it's good to see that change starting to happen, but obviously it needs to be much more significant. I have a question here from Kia asking about Dylan, for Dylan. I was wondering if there are differences between how Indigenous history is taught in Canada and the USA, and how non-Indigenous people receive that history between the two countries. I mean, you can both speak to this. It's just Dylan's there.
So I've been in Canada here for about 2 years on and off. I don't know all too much about the teaching of history in Canada. I have talked to some people here and there, but most of the people I interact with daily either go to school on the reservation, so it's very different. Their culture is a huge standpoint in the high school here, so they get a lot of that. As well as, obviously, if you're going off the reservation for school, you're coming back and you're still living in the community. So it's different. You're getting exposed to those things, even if it's not your cup of tea in some way, shape, or form. From what I have heard from people, it's not very different at all. They might talk about it a tiny bit more than the US, but it's still really generic, really basic. It's not that in depth. So maybe now it might be a tiny bit different. Canada, in some ways, are a little bit ahead of the United States. In some ways, we'll say it's not every way, and they still have a long way to go as well. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's to the level that it needs to be, even here in Canada. So
that's really interesting to hear. I have a history question now. Why do you think that pre-Columbian cities, was sort of historical representation, why do you think that pre-Columbian cities and urban centers in North America, e.g., I don't know how to pronounce this, Cahokia? Thank you, in Illinois, have received so little historical attention compared to those of, say, the Mayan or Incas further south? And do you think that contributes to this ignorant, static culture perception that you mentioned previously?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump off on that one first, I guess, too. I think definitely. I can't really tell you why they don't get as much attention. Maybe because basically for the Inca or the Aztec, other communities down there, their culture was kind of cut off at that point. That was the culture that a lot of the Europeans saw when they came to contact with, especially the Aztec over there. Over here, it had kind of gone away from the mound building societies and Cahokia and all those other massive, almost metropolis-like cities all around the United States. So when the Europeans come here, it's smaller villages compared to those big city centers and things like that. So that's the first thing people think of. That's what's in their mind. But also, I would say that it fits the narrative. If the whole kind of narrative in the US is that these are simple people. They're not advanced in any way, shape, or form. And if you're saying that they have, trade networks and waterways and engineering and architecture, horticulture, and so on and so forth. You can list all types of things that these cities had that rival European cities at the time, if not better than European cities. Then you can't have this idea that these people are simple, so it's okay that we're doing these things to them, or it's okay that we're bringing our culture and forcing it upon them to make them better or make them civilized, if you're showing that they're uncivilized, right? Because having those cities that are so well developed and well taken care of shows that Native people are civilized, and that would destroy the whole narrative and make it so that people would say, well, we're doing something wrong here, much easier than than people saying, well, it's just wrong because we're doing this to people as a whole, which some people kind of think that. But yeah.
The narrative is that folks didn't even have permanent housing, that everybody was just migratory and only camped out here or there, for a couple days at a time, and didn't really connect to any piece of land. It was a vast empty continent. And certainly metropolises, urban city centers are in direct contradiction to that narrative. Beyond the advancement of it, just the presence of them. Even if they were as dirty and filthy as some of the other cities of the world, which by and large they weren't. By and large, these cities were places that had access to water features and were kept very clean. One of the things that was very notable, DeSoto got a chance to see some of these cities built, and a lot of the destruction actually came because of the pigs that were brought over with DeSoto, which were let to run wild and reproduce and spread their diseases amongst the deer and other animals that lived in that part of the world, and you saw a collapse of the ecosystem because the deer was the main game that those people depended on for being able to feed themselves. And not so the sicknesses came from people to people, but also from animals to animals. And really just, I think it was the 1540s when DeSoto marches into Memphis and sees these huge mound cities, just, some of the biggest cities that he'd ever seen at that time. And by the time, I think the mid 17s, they're gone. They're just absolutely gone because of disease. So that had a huge impact on the actual presence of the people in them. But the narrative that this was an empty continent, it means that it's free for the taking. That you're not even dispossessing anybody of anything. It's just, nobody's there. It's just made for everyone, anybody, as long as they've got the right color skin. So that's the narrative. But sort of to touch on as well with the with the way that there is a difference in the South and how Indians have been perceived and treated down there as well. There's this sort of a different approach that the Spanish had to colonization of creating a racial hierarchy based on mixing. So you have the Indios and the Mestizos and the Hispaniola. So you've got these levels of how much whiteness do you have in you, but there's never been this idea of a complete depopulation, as we've seen north of the Mexican United States border, up into Canada, where there's been I think a large sense of the North that they've succeeded in ethnically cleansing Canada and the United States, and there's now a wall on our southern border to keep the Indians out. And you hear Pat Buchanan talked about it, that these people are not white Western Christian people. And it's like, well, wait a minute, what are you really saying? Because they are, you look in Mexico City, how many Catholics are there? It's most of the whole city. So, and what makes somebody Western? They're driving cars, they've got, they've got stock exchanges, they've got democracy, they've got a president. So what is the real problem? The real problem, obviously, is the one that he was bold enough to even mention, is that they aren't white. They are Indian, and they were the success of, as we've seen with the recent killings and the talking of replacement theory, but the replacement that has actually happened, in blood, in death, is the replacement of the actual people of this land with the colonizers, and that has been fought with, with the blood of our folks, and it's something that there's a ambition to maintain among a fair amount of people that embrace that ideology still. And that has to be seen, that has to be talked about. And in looking at that, we just to talk about some of the educational issues. I haven't been to Canada, but one of the things I see that they have up there is they have the native television network in Canada, which is great, and they have a native television network in New Mexico, which is great. Folks actually getting to produce stories and tell stories, choose what stories are important to us to tell. It's great to see. But I know, you talk about school down in South America, where I've got more experience myself as far as interaction, to see, how indigenous kids are treated down there. You see the Spanish speaking kids and how they get treated in the American schools as much how the indigenous kids get treated in Mexico, in Colombia, and in Peru and these other areas, that they oftentimes are not Spanish speakers, and they get left behind because of it, and they get stigmatized because of it. They get called dirty Indian because of it. And these things are very, very real part of how indigenous people are still treated, and it's a socially acceptable racial hierarchy that's firmly embedded in the social structure in that part of the world that makes it so a lot of the people don't even want to self-identify as indigenous people, even though they are very much so obviously indigenous. They seek to get away from that identity because it's a bad thing. It's such a bad thing to be a native person there. The people don't want to be identified as that, and they try to avoid that part of themselves. They'll even switch speaking from the language that they speak in. I tried to speak to people in Quechua there, and to try to help my own learning of that language, but nobody would respond back to me. They might understand what I'd say, but they'd still respond back to me in Spanish because they didn't want to speak in the stigmatized language. And that's what we see with some of the experiences of the South. Where I think it's sort of because people are put at the bottom, it's okay for them to still exist because they are still continue to be the exploited. They still continue to be this pool of labor and resource that can benefit those people at the top of that hierarchy. So they have a place that's allowable.
I think that's something that we often don't realize because we don't teach this history, is just how explicit, both historically and in the present day, the destruction of Indigenous people is. Like, this is not hard to find, nor is the racism about Indigenous people. The next question is actually linked to that in a way. So Ashley wanted to know what your view was on the term Indian and the use of Indian, I guess, by both Native people and non-Native people. And I apologize for potentially using it.
Hartman, if you want to go first on this one.
Yeah, all right. We're not from India. I've met a lot of people from India. I don't take any offense to the term. Most of the people I've met from India, I've gotten along with pretty well. I've had some, I absolutely love Indian food. I think that there's I used to get go to a Ayurvedic practitioner for some of the medicinal treatments of my body was from the tradition of medicine that comes from India. But it's just incorrect. However, it's been so completely a part of what's saturated into how we discuss, who we are as many different kinds of people all lumped into one. It's either Indian or Native American, and neither one of those are actually really correct. And yet, we've got to have some way to talk about who we are and discuss who we are. I don't take any offense to the term. It's just, we've been called that ever since Christopher Columbus thought he landed in India to get the spices and didn't realize there was a whole other continent or two in the way. And that's sort of it, the whole of it. I don't take any offense to it. I don't mind it. I use it myself out of convenience, but it's not actually accurate. It's not who we actually are. And even Native American doesn't work because there's, probably a good 10 or 20 actual major ethnic groups. And then you divide that even further into, how 540 different federally recognized tribes within the United States. And then you spread that out to all of the Americas, and that counts. I don't know. I don't even know the number of how many different people get lumped into that term. Be like calling somebody a Eurasian. And certainly, that there might be truth in that, but there's a lot of cultural difference between the people on that island of England versus the people on that island of Japan, and a whole world in between. So it's lumping those two ends together is basically what happens here in the States.
Yeah. For me, when I was a kid growing up, I didn't really like it. I didn't use it that much. I tried to use Native. I thought it was a little bit more polite at least. But like Hartman says, it's really just lumping people together. It's not really highlighting just how diverse Native America is throughout South, Central, North America. It's extremely diverse. I used to tell people when I worked at the museum, if you're looking at just the United States alone, it's probably as diverse as like 7 to 10 different Europes, all just in the size of America. And we all know how diverse Europe is through their different cultures and languages and countries and so on. I like Hartman says, I use it. I find that when speaking to other indigenous people and stuff like that, it's used a lot more because people kind of know what it's meant in that setting. The only time that I don't like it is I find that it can be used sometimes in a derogatory way, and that's the only time that I don't really like it. Beyond that, I don't. It's like Hartman said, it's so ingrained into the U.S. culture, Canadian culture, that you really can't get away from it. So as long as it's not being used in some kind of derogatory way, I really don't mind all that much.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's this is quite a specific question, but I think we can sort of interpret it slightly more broadly around the care that we should take when we're furthering kind of misrepresentative or limited representations of Native people. So the question is, there is a proposal to perform Hiawatha wedding in London this year, and I'm here to hear how this exoticized, romanticized view of Native American history feels to real people today, and if there is any way a performance like this can ever be delivered in a way that doesn't diminish or invalidate the real histories of Native people.
I don't specifically know that play, so I don't necessarily know what it goes on. I know what the traditional story of Hiawatha is because that's the territory I live in. That's the community that that I live in right now, and that's the community that my girlfriend and son come from. But it's to be said with anything that is a romanticized version of any culture, it's not really positive, right? Because we're playing into stereotypes if we're romanticizing any culture, and Native culture has to bear the brunt of that, I feel like, because I feel like it's the most romanticized culture, especially here in the US and Canada. There's like 3 major Native tropes. It's the stoic Indian, the brutal savage, and the romanticized, like romantic book novel Indian. Those are the 3 things that you're constantly dealing with any media, any books, anything like that. And that doesn't do anything for the actual people except put more falsehoods and lies into in people's head on what a Native should act like, what a Native should look like, what a Native should be like. And it's dehumanizing them. It's not portraying Native people as humans, just like any other culture in any country. You just want to be seen as a human, and constantly romanticizing or any of those stereotypical tropes for any culture is dehumanizing that culture. And that's one of the biggest things that Native people have to deal with constantly, is the dehumanizing. So
yeah, I'd say nothing about us without us is for us. And that's the truth. You've got a Victorian era play that was written without Native people, so it was, like I don't see how this is going to turn out good. I really don't. I've got a meeting later tonight to talk with some folks from or about a play in England that's possibly going to happen, where they were thankfully had the foresight enough to realize that moving forward without actually involving Native people in a very real way in the process, they were going to end up with something that was a disaster. I'm thankful that they made that choice, because when I look at what they had in pre-production, It didn't seem like it was going to go over well. It would have been pretty offensive. And yeah, we get constantly brought into this whole idea of the romanticization and the fetishization, the huge problem of missing and murdered indigenous women in throughout the Americas. Throughout the Americas is a huge problem because of the sexualization and the fetishization of Native people as sex objects. And it's something even in my life I've experienced on the in England. I was touched inappropriately by an elder woman who had her jewels of office on, her actual jewels of office like they have there in England, and felt free to help herself to touching me. I know that also happened to me a number of times at the plantation when I was dressed in my loincloth, and that there is people who felt that made me available for them to touch and grab as they felt like. I'm assuming that probably happened to you too, Dylan.
A lot
Yeah.
of questions of what's under the breechcloth. Can you show me? I was just on Facebook the other day and I saw this mannequin of a Native person with a breechcloth on. This woman's taking a stick trying to lift it up, like stuff like that happened all the time. It was just a standard day at Plymouth. The over sexualizing people, compared to modern standards, where very little dress, especially in the summertime. I'd run around in just a breechcloth because one, it's way more comfortable than your modern clothes. I could go jump in the river, cool off, and not worry about anything getting wet or anything. But yeah, it's just there's an over sexualization of Native people, especially when you're in your traditional clothing, because it leaves a lot more open than our modern clothing. And for whatever reason, people think they have that right to do whatever they want, ask whatever they want, or insinuate whatever they want.
Thank you for sharing. Sorry, Hartman.
I was just gonna say I don't know that there's any of the guys that did work at the plantation that didn't experience that. I think it may be one of the few places where I think the men on the staff had more to worry about being groped than the women was Plymouth Plantation. Like I remember one of the guys who worked there, Ken Kittigwa, somebody pulled the knot out of his breechcloth. He almost fell down. He had to grab it and run up to the dressing room. So it's like it was just such a common thing there. Unfortunately, but a play like this Hiawatha's Wedding, or all these fantasy novels that you see that really draw from the captive narratives. So they aren't helpful, and that's what they lead to. That's what creates as far as the expectation of how people feel like they can interact with us now here today. So.
Absolutely. And I want to highlight, thank you very much for sharing those stories. And I want to highlight also that your experience happened in the UK as well, because I think that commonly British people think of like sort of so repressed Indigenous history that they've decided that we're not entirely shaped by this colonial narrative and this fetishization, which is absolutely impacting how people behave. And I'm deeply appalled that has happened anywhere, but particularly in the UK. We're actually coming to the end, so I was going to ask one final question, because I think this is a really important thing to touch on, if you guys don't mind potentially running over by a couple of minutes. This question is about residential schools. This person was saying that they're an American living in Canada, and they've been following the news for the search for unmarked graves at Indigenous residential schools across Canada, and have been waiting for the US to follow suit, but it seems that's barely made the news in the States. I'm wondering what you both make of this, and if or how you see the US ever reckoning with its role in residential schools. How would you like to see Americans grapple with this part of the country's past? I know this is a huge question, but would you also mind clarifying what residential schools are? Because we've got quite a mixed interdisciplinary audience as well, please.
Yeah, so basically residential schools are schools where Native people, Native children were taken and sent to be, Christianized, Europeanized, basically forced assimilation into your white European American society, white European Canadian society, so on and so forth. A lot of the time kids were horribly physically abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused, and a lot of them ended up dying. A lot of kids tried to run away and either died due to starvation or exposure to the elements, got caught and were punished severely. That's just a very, very brief overview. You know, you can go on and on and on about kind of really all the terrible things that happened at residential schools. To go off of that, I don't think America really is ever ready to say that they had a part in it. If you look through America's history, they've done a lot of terrible things to a lot of minority groups, and they've never really said, oh, we're sorry about that. We played a massive part in letting this be allowed, and it's still affecting people to this day. They really kind of just shrug it off and say, we'll get over it, and we're going to move on. I know a lot of people, me personally, obviously didn't go to residential schools. I'm a lot younger than a lot of the people that did, but I know a lot of people that went to residential schools in my family, my girlfriend's family specifically, because they were pretty prevalent up here, especially where I grew up in the States. By the time of like my grandparents' age, they weren't as big of a thing. Out west they were a lot more, but in the East, not so much during like the 70s, even though people still did get sent to them. But in Canada, they're very bad. And after residential schools, they still had what are called Indian day schools, which are basically the same thing. And I had a lot of family members go to that. And a lot of family members be very, very affected by the things that they suffered from there. You know, it's not my personal information to talk about, so I won't go into much detail, but I know a lot of people that spent their life going from different family members to try and avoid going to these schools. I know a lot of people that suffered very extreme abuse at these schools, and it still affects the community. It affects people till this day. And overall, it's just a very, very horrid part of America and Canada's history. And I don't think America really ever is going to say we did something wrong, because that's not really America's thing to do. They say, well, it happened and we're going to try to cover it up or try to just change the narrative so that it's not as bad as it seems. So, yeah.
So just, you know, sort of bring some numbers and stats to all this, you know. I mean, these were essentially, these were genocidal concentration camps. Almost half the kids that went to them died. You know, that's a huge proportion. Graveyards next to schools in Canada, I think at this point they've identified nearly 10,000 graves at this point at different, you know, schools and throughout Canada. They've only just begun to actually do the work in the United States, and I think they're at about 500 or so roughly in the United States. And they haven't started to discuss how in in the other parts of the world, you know, including you know, southwest of the United States, because that at one point was Mexico. They had the mission system, which was essentially the same thing. You know, it was a forced re-education, and you know, the abuses that went on were so horrible. You know, there's a couple that really stand out in mind, and to make you understand, these are schools that still operate up into the 1980s, and people that are people who I worked with, my you know, my coworkers and such, they experienced these schools. So that I am of the generation that saw some of the last of these you know, these schools. I didn't go to one myself, but these are people that are my age that experienced this not that long ago. And you know, some of the most horrible stories I know that I remember hearing is, you know, of one where a priest had sexually, you know, raped a young teenage girl, and in order to destroy the evidence when the child was born, just simply put the infant child into the incinerator, into the basement of the school building alive. And you know, And there's discussion, there's talk about the hearing of the popping, and just really horrific stuff. Another really awful example that that still sort of like stays with me and sticks with me is a young kindergartner girl who wouldn't stop speaking in her language, and one of the nuns went and knocked her down and stepped on her neck across the top step and killed her and broke her neck, and then made the kindergarten class walk over her body into the classroom for the day's lessons. And these are the types of things that the kids that ran away, that died out in the fields, were running away from. And this is the things that killed those kids that are in those holes in the ground. And they bedded kids with tuberculosis with healthy kids to do medical experimentation. They leased the kids out, for sex trafficking rings, and they leased the kids out for medical experimentation for different doctors' offices and things like this. So this is just, it's not just simply an abusive school system. It really was a system of extermination and genocide, and it needs to be recognized as that. They forcibly took kids, a lot of the kids that they resisted taking them away, they sent the parents away to prison. And there's a bunch of Native prisoners in Alcatraz, one of the hardest prisons in the United States at the time, where they had Al Capone, and they sent parents there for trying to protect their kids from these schools. And that's the truth of the experience of what Native people have endured to try to just exist and remain ourselves and who we are. And it's something that has to be reconciled. And at this point, I don't know how they're never going to be able to make it right, but something has to be done to recognize and see and deal with what happened. And so far what we've gotten is nothing.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing those stories. And thank you for just being so honest with us. I think the fact that some of this information will be new to many of the people in the panel is proof that colonialism is still alive and kicking, and a significant violence, and within the UK as well as within the US. And we can recognize our own complicity and our own history in this space. And that's something that people can take time to educate themselves on. And panels such as this is such a wonderful way for us to learn. So we really do appreciate you taking the time. Did you want to add anything at the end before I do just like a sort of allow everyone to thank you?
Yeah, thanks everybody for showing up. I hope that you got something that it was
no, thank you. Yeah, thank you to you guys so much for your time and your energy and your honesty about this. There's many people in this group. Oh, the thank yous are exploding. There's many people in this group studying these spaces and directly thinking about how they represent Native people and diverse Native people. So I think this is a great opportunity to have an impact. Given that there have been so many questions, it might be maybe if you guys are interested, we do something like this again in the future, and get some more people in, maybe some schools in and things like that, but we can definitely talk about that. Yeah.
I just wanted to say too, if anyone has any questions that weren't answered and they want answered, they can reach out to me. I know that I'm willing to either talk over like Facebook or email or whatever if they want a question answered or so on and so forth. So
fantastic. Do you mind, do you want to drop your email in the chat, or do you want to pass it through me, or?
I can just put in the chat.
Cool, thanks guys.
I'll add mine in as well.
Yeah, you don't have to. So thank you so much to both of our speakers. This brings us to the end of the first day of our conference. I want to thank all the speakers throughout the day. It's really difficult presenting in Zoom into the kind of abyss of Zoom and not necessarily knowing what the feedback or questions are going to be, as Hartman and Dilla are just experiencing. So everyone today, including people who presented for the very first time and chaired for the very first time, I want to say a huge thank you. This is just the first day of the conference. Tomorrow it's hybrid, and we'll be looking at things like popular culture, misrepresentations of conflict in the Americas. So lots of interesting things happen tomorrow if anyone's available to join in, and we're looking forward to even more speakers getting an opportunity to share their research. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Millie.
Did you want to add anything about tomorrow, or are we just kind of closing up?
Nope. Tomorrow there will be both hybrid and in person. We'll be at Grimmond if you want to come by and eat a cookie that the university is paying for. That Grimmond, yes, we'll be at Grimmond. We'll also be hybrid as well, and we will be talking about similar subjects that look at resistance and political protests. And yeah, this was such an amazing panel. I really want to thank you, Millie, for moderating, for Hartman, and also your other speaker, Dylan, for being so emotionally present and answering such difficult questions. So again, thank you so much. I really appreciate this panel. It was great.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah, appreciate being included.
You're welcome whenever, Hartman. Great. I said you're welcome whenever. We'll have you again, please.
With funding from a department that needs to give funding to Hartman and Dylan and the whole thing. Yes. Well, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Go over without saying. Okay. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you so much for being here.
Bye.